Here is the strangest thing you will ever think about. If God is all-powerful, can God create a stone so heavy that even God cannot lift it? If yes, then there is something God cannot do. Lift the stone. If no, then there is something God cannot do. Create it. Either way, something slips through the fingers of omnipotence. And this is not a cheap riddle. This is the universe itself handing us a mirror and asking, have you really thought about what you are claiming? Because the moment you define something as infinite, unlimited, and all-encompassing, the very act of definition begins to destroy it. Let's start somewhere comfortable, somewhere ordinary. You wake up in the morning. The sun rises, as it always does, dragging light across your ceiling in slow golden strips. You make tea. The water boils because of heat. The heat comes from electricity. The electricity comes from a power plant. The power plant burns fuel or splits atoms. The atoms were forged in a dying star billions of years before your grandmother was born. And that star was born from the collapse of a gas cloud left over from the Big Bang. Every single morning. Tea, stars, the Big Bang. That chain of causes stretching back through time. Most of us, at some point in our lives, have looked at that chain and asked, but what started it? What was the very first cause? What lit the fuse? And for thousands of years, across every culture, on every continent, the answer that came back was the same word. God. And that answer felt satisfying. It felt complete. It had weight to it, the weight of certainty in an uncertain world. God is the explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. God is the reason the laws of physics are what they are, and not something else. God is the architect behind the improbable elegance of a universe fine-tuned so precisely that if the gravitational constant were different by 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, there would be no stars, no planets, no tea, no you. That is a breathtaking argument, genuinely. The universe is staggeringly unlikely. The numbers are absurd. The precision is real. When physicists calculate how finely tuned the cosmological constant is, the energy of empty space, they find it is tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. That is a number so large it dwarfs the total number of atoms in the observable universe. The universe should not exist. And yet here it is. Here you are, drinking tea, made of stardust, asking questions. So the instinct to reach for God, the instinct that says something must have designed this, is not stupid. It is not primitive. It is, in fact, the correct instinct applied to the wrong solution. Because the problem is not the question. The problem is what happens when you follow the answer all the way to the end. Here is the question nobody asks. When someone says, God explains the universe, the conversation usually stops there. We nod, we move on. We feel that something profound has been said. But there is a question sitting right underneath that answer, quiet and patient, waiting. And the question is simply this: what explains God? Not in a dismissive way, not as a rhetorical trick, as a genuine, logical, unavoidable question. Because if the universe requires an explanation, if the existence of complex, ordered, fine-tuned reality demands a cause, then by that exact same logic, God requires an explanation too. You cannot use everything needs a cause as your reason for God and then immediately say, except God, God needs no cause. That is not an answer. That is a rule applied selectively. And in physics, in mathematics, in logic, selectively applied rules are not rules at all. They are preferences dressed up as reasoning. Think about it this way. Imagine a child asks, who made the world? You say, God made the world. The child asks, who made God? And you say, nobody. God always existed. The child, with perfect innocent logic, says, then why couldn't the world always have existed? Why not? What is the special ingredient that God has which the universe lacks? The ingredient that allows God to be self-existing, uncaused, eternal. but denies those same properties to the universe itself. If your answer is that God is by definition the kind of thing that needs no cause, then you have not explained anything. You have simply defined your way out of the question.
And this is where physics and logic begin to get genuinely interesting.
Because the moment you look carefully at the concept of God, not emotionally, not culturally, but logically, you find that it starts to collapse inward, not from outside attack, but from its own internal structure. Like a star that has burned through its fuel and can no longer hold itself up against its own gravity. Let us talk about what the concept of God actually claims, stripped down to its logical skeleton. The classical definition, refined over centuries by theologians and philosophers, says God is omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, perfectly good, and omnipresent, present everywhere. God is also described as necessary, meaning God could not fail to exist, and as the uncaused first cause, the thing that started everything without itself being started. These are bold claims, extraordinarily bold, and for a long time philosophers argued about whether they were coherent, whether they even made internal sense, before anyone got to the question of whether they were true. And this is where the surface explanation lives. At the surface level, the concept works like a mathematical constant. In physics, we have constants: the speed of light, Planck's constant, the gravitational constant. These are numbers that simply are. We did not derive them from something deeper. They just show up in the equations of reality. And God, in this surface framing, is like an ultimate constant, a brute fact about existence from which everything else follows.
This framing is philosophically serious. It is called the cosmological argument, the argument from first cause. It says, contingent things, things that might or might not exist, require an explanation. The universe is contingent. Therefore, the universe requires an explanation outside itself. And that explanation must be something necessary, something that cannot fail to exist. That necessary thing we call God. At this level of analysis, the argument has genuine force. It correctly identifies that the universe has a beginning, and physics agrees. The Big Bang was a beginning. Time, space, matter, energy, all of it emerged from a state of almost unimaginable density around 13.8 billion years ago. Before that, and the word before becomes deeply problematic here, our equations break down completely. We genuinely do not know what came before, or if before even means anything. So at the surface, God as first cause steps into a real gap. The gap is real. The darkness at the edge of our equations is real. But then comes the twist. The twist is this: God does not fill the gap. God duplicates it. Here is what I mean. The problem we are trying to solve is, why does anything exist? Why is there a universe governed by laws, filled with structure, buzzing with complexity? The proposed solution is because God created it. But now ask, why does God exist? Why is there a God rather than no God? If the answer is God just exists, necessarily, by definition, then we have not solved the problem of existence. We have simply relocated it. We have pushed the mystery back one step and then declared victory. Think about it in terms of information. In physics, information is never destroyed, and any explanation of reality must itself be real, must itself contain information, structure, complexity. An entity that is omniscient contains, by definition, infinite information. It knows every particle, every quantum state, every thought, every possible configuration of everything that has ever existed or could exist. That is an almost unimaginable quantity of complexity. And here is the critical question that physicist and philosopher alike must ask. Where did that complexity come from? The universe's complexity, the thing we are trying to explain, is finite. Vast, yes. Staggering, yes. But at least in principle, bounded.
The complexity of an omniscient being is literally infinite, so the explanation is infinitely more complex than the thing being explained. By any measure of explanatory economy, by Occam's razor, by the principle of parsimony that science runs on, you have made the problem vastly worse, not better. This is the twist that changes everything. Every answer God provides, God simultaneously demands. You wanted to explain fine-tuning? God is infinitely more finely tuned, a being of infinite precision and specificity, requiring no explanation at all. You wanted to explain the origin of the universe? God has an origin story too, one that, conveniently, we are asked never to question. The concept of God does not solve the hard problem. It is the hard problem wearing a costume. I want you to imagine something. Close your eyes if you can, or just let the image build in your mind. You are standing at the edge of an infinite library. Not a building, infinite. Shelves stretching in every direction, forever, containing every book that has ever been written, every book that could be written, every possible arrangement of every possible sentence in every possible language. An infinite library. Now someone walks up to you and says, I can explain why this library exists. You lean in because yes, you want to know. You have always wanted to know. They say, outside the library there is a librarian. And you ask, what is the librarian like? They say, the librarian knows every book in the library perfectly. Every word of every book, simultaneously, in perfect detail. Now think about what that means. The library contains infinite information. The librarian knows all of it, which means the librarian's mind contains at least as much information as the library, probably more, because the librarian also understands why the library is the way it is, and knows all possible libraries that could have existed instead, and understands the metastructure of all possible realities. So the librarian's mind is more complex, more information-rich, more staggeringly improbable than the library itself. And you have explained nothing. You have just added a second, larger library and called it a person. Now push the thought experiment further. The librarian, you are told, exists necessarily, could not fail to exist, has always existed and will always exist. Now ask, what determines the librarian's personality, preferences, values? Because if the librarian chose to create this library rather than a different one, or no library at all, then the librarian has preferences. Preferences require a history, a structure, a reason. A perfectly blank, structure-free, infinitely simple being cannot have preferences. Preferences are information, and information, as we have established, requires an explanation. The thought experiment reveals something beautiful and devastating at the same time. An all-knowing, all-powerful, preference-having entity is the most complex thing imaginable, and complexity never explains itself. Let us go deeper. Let us look at what physics actually says about existence, complexity, and where things come from. At the smallest scale, the quantum scale, the universe is not a collection of solid, definite objects sitting in empty space. It is a shimmering field of probabilities. Every particle is described by a wave function, a mathematical object that contains, simultaneously, all the possible states a particle could be in. It does not choose one state until it is observed, measured, interacted with. And even then, the interaction does not cause the wave function to collapse from outside. The system as a whole evolves according to the Schrödinger equation, deterministically, mathematically, without any external push. The universe, at its most fundamental level, is a self-evolving mathematical structure. It does not need to be told what to do next. The equations are what it does next. Now go up a layer. At the level of thermodynamics, the physics of heat and entropy, we find something remarkable. Complexity and structure emerge naturally from simple rules. You do not need to design a snowflake. The physics of water molecules interacting at low temperatures generates perfect hexagonal symmetry without any architect. You do not need to design the spiral arms of a galaxy. Gravity and angular momentum do it automatically, over billions of years, from an initially nearly uniform distribution of hydrogen gas. Complexity is cheap. This is one of the most underappreciated facts in all of science. The universe does not need instructions to become complex. It needs only simple laws and time.
Go up another layer. At the level of biology, the scale of cells and DNA, we find the most spectacular complexity of all: self-replicating, evolving, adapting systems, life. And for most of human history, life seemed like the strongest argument for design. Nothing is more improbably intricate than a living cell. But we now know, from a century and a half of biology, that this improbable intricacy is the predictable output of natural selection operating on random variation over vast stretches of time. No designer needed. The appearance of design without a designer. At every layer, quantum, thermodynamic, biological, the universe turns out to be extraordinarily good at generating structure without instruction. The whole job description of God keeps shrinking. Now let us zoom out, all the way out, and then further. The observable universe is about 93 billion light-years in diameter. It contains an estimated 2 trillion galaxies. Each galaxy contains, on average, hundreds of billions of stars. Around many of those stars orbit planets. On at least one of those planets, and almost certainly many more, chemistry became biology, and biology became consciousness. And consciousness became curious enough to ask why anything exists at all. At this scale, the universe looks like it was made for life, because life is here, looking at it and saying so. But this is a logical trap called the anthropic bias. Of course we find ourselves in a universe compatible with our existence. We could not be in any other kind. A fish swimming in a lake does not conclude the lake was made for fish. It is just where fish can be. We are where we can be. Now zoom in to a single proton. A proton is made of quarks, bound together by the strong nuclear force, mediated by particles called gluons. The mass of a proton is not simply the sum of its quark masses. It is mostly the energy of the gluon field binding them together. Matter is, at this scale, mostly energy frozen in patterns of interaction. There is no solid stuff at the bottom. There is only structure, relationship, mathematical pattern all the way down. And now zoom out to the largest scales again, beyond galaxies, to the large-scale structure of the universe. Filaments of dark matter spanning hundreds of millions of light-years, connecting galaxy clusters like a cosmic web. Between them, vast empty voids. The whole thing looks, at this scale, almost biological, like neurons in a brain, like capillaries in a leaf. Is this designed? Or is this what happens when gravity operates on matter and dark matter over 13.8 billion years? The simulations say the latter. Run the physics forward from the Big Bang with the right initial conditions, and the cosmic web emerges naturally, no instructions required. From quarks to the cosmic web, the universe is a machine for generating structure. And nowhere in this picture is there a gap that logically demands a mind to fill it. Here is the big insight. Are you ready? Because it is not what most people expect. The insight is not that God definitely does not exist. The insight is something more precise and, in a way, more troubling. The classical concept of God is logically incoherent. Not merely unproven, not just unsupported by evidence, but internally inconsistent, contradicting itself before it even gets to the question of evidence. Let us walk through the contradictions, not to be cruel to the concept, but because looking at them clearly is the only honest thing to do. Omnipotence and logic cannot coexist. An omnipotent being can do anything, but can it create a four-sided triangle? Can it make 2 + 2 = 5? Can it make a thing simultaneously exist and not exist? These are not failures of power, they are logical contradictions. And logic is not a constraint outside God that limits God. Logic is the structure of coherence itself. A being that violates logic is not powerful,
it is simply undefined. It is a sentence that means nothing. Omniscience and free will cannot coexist. If God knows, from before the beginning of time, every choice every human being will ever make, then those choices are not free. They are predetermined. They are already written. You are reading a script you did not write and cannot change. And if that is true, the concept of divine judgment, of reward and punishment for choices, becomes morally absurd. You cannot be blamed for following a script. Perfect goodness and the existence of suffering cannot coexist. This is the oldest and most powerful of all the internal contradictions, the problem of evil. A being that is simultaneously omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good would prevent all unnecessary suffering. The world contains vast, catastrophic, pointless suffering. Children born with terminal diseases, earthquakes, famines, the slow extinction of species over billions of years, long before any human ever existed to commit any sin. The standard theological responses are strained at best, dishonest at worst. These are not external attacks on the concept of God. These are the concept of God, placed under logical pressure, discovering that it cannot hold its own shape. But here is where I want to be careful and honest, because philosophy done well is not about winning arguments. It is about getting closer to what is actually true. The fact that the classical theological concept of God collapses under logical pressure does not mean the universe is cold, mechanical, and devoid of wonder. Quite the opposite. When you remove the false certainty, when you stop pretending that an ancient anthropomorphic concept of a supernatural person is an adequate description of ultimate reality, you do not end up with emptiness. You end up with something far stranger and far more interesting. You end up with actual mystery, the real kind. Not the comforting mystery of a story with a known author, but the vertiginous mystery of a universe that genuinely does not yet have a complete explanation. A universe where the question, why is there something rather than nothing, remains genuinely open. Where physicists and philosophers are still working on it. Where the answer, if it comes, will almost certainly be nothing like what any ancient text imagined. Consider what we do know. The universe operates according to mathematical laws. Why mathematical? Why should abstract structures invented by human minds to describe nature turn out to be the nature they describe? The physicist Eugene Wigner called this the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and it is genuinely unreasonable, genuinely mysterious. Consider consciousness. You are not just made of atoms. You are atoms that are aware of being atoms. The fact that matter can observe itself, that the universe can turn its gaze inward through the medium of biological brains, is one of the deepest unsolved problems in all of science. We do not know why there is something it is like to be you. We do not know why the lights are on. This is the hard problem of consciousness, and it is hard precisely because our best physical theories leave it untouched. These mysteries, the mathematical structure of reality, the emergence of consciousness, the existence of existence itself, are not solved by God. But they are not trivialized by the absence of God either. They are simply real mysteries, standing in the open, inviting genuine inquiry. That, it seems to me, is far more respectful of the universe than any easy answer. So we come to the end. And the end, as it turns out, is a beginning. We started with a paradox, the stone too heavy even for omnipotence to lift. And we followed it, through familiar morning tea and cosmic fine-tuning, through the hidden question that never gets asked, through thought experiments about infinite libraries and omniscient librarians, through quarks and galaxies and the emergence of complexity from simple rules. And we arrived here, at the conclusion that the concept of God, in its classical form, does not solve the mystery of existence. It is the mystery of existence, reformulated as a person and declared off-limits. But here's what that means, and listen carefully, because this is the part that changes things. It means the question is still alive. The real question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe have the structure it has? Why does consciousness exist? What is the deep nature of reality? None of these have been answered, not by theology, not yet by physics. They are open, wide open. They are the most important questions a thinking being can ask, and they are genuinely, thrillingly unanswered. You are alive at a moment in history when humanity is just beginning to develop the tools, mathematical, experimental, philosophical, to approach these questions with any real precision. Quantum gravity, the multiverse hypothesis, integrated information theory for consciousness. These are early, tentative, incomplete, but they are real attempts at real answers, not just comfortable stories. And here's the most mind-blowing thought I can leave you with. Whatever the ultimate answer turns out to be, and perhaps there is no single answer, perhaps the question dissolves into a deeper understanding of what explanation even means, it will almost certainly be stranger than we expect. Every time science has peered beneath the surface of reality, it has found something no one imagined. Curved space-time, quantum superposition, the genetic code, dark energy. Reality has a deep habit of being far weirder than the most creative human mythology. So do not mourn the collapse of the old concept. Be grateful for it. Because what collapses was always a ceiling built to keep out the vertigo of genuine wonder. And now that it is gone, look up. There is no ceiling. There never was. There is only the universe, vast, strange, luminous, and utterly magnificently unexplained.